Welcome back to Railway. Today I've got something really special, a quick look at some of the new features for railways in City Skylines II. I know you're keen, so let's jump right in. To start with, what we have here is an industrial port area with a cargo port and a nearby rail depot. One thing I want to focus your attention on is the cargo train waiting at the bottom of the screen for its turn to go into the port. Watch how, as the train leaves, the one that's waiting will continue to wait until the entire vehicle has exited the junction. The next thing that I wanted to highlight is just how close you can get different networks to fit together in the vanilla game. The clearance or the envelope that sits around the network itself is now much tighter. This is the new transport line tool, which is how you create both passenger and cargo lines. Not only do you select station stops along the way, but you can also select waypoints if you want to specifically control which tracks a line uses. Here's how you might want to take advantage of this. I have an established station in town, but want to create an express line from the edge of the map to the airport, bypassing the downtown station. I've built bypass tracks under the station and across the flying junction. All I need to do now is to set waypoints to route the line via this bypass rather than through the station. A quick thing to show here is for people who have had issues with trains backing up at the edge of the map in the past. Have a look just how quickly the train despawns. Now I want to talk about curve radius. This is something that's really important in railway design to make sure that you're not creating curves which are too tight. What's really interesting in City Skylines II is that there is now this concept of the minimum curve radius in the game. So you'll see that if you try and make an arc around a 90-degree bend, there is a point where it says, no, the curve is too tight. Now in the vanilla game, this curve radius is about 34 meters. But to give you a sense of scale, I'm looking at a poster on my wall right now which has the technical specifications for the British Rail Class 43 or Intercity 125 train. The minimum curve radius for these locomotives is 80 meters, and that is the minimum. So think very, very slow movements around a depot rather than curves being taken at high speed. Now, while we're here, a few quick notes on the Catenary wires themselves. There seems to be a bug that a few people have noticed. The swaying of the wires is back to front. You'll see in this video, as the train is navigating a bend, the pantograph is bouncing up and down as it loses contact with the wire itself. But as soon as the train gets onto the straightaway, it behaves as you would expect. Next up, let's take a look at track gradient. Typically on a freight railway, you want a 1 to 2% maximum gradient. The great news is that the game now has a gradient indicator built into it, so you can very easily know that the track that you're creating is on a realistic gradient. In this bit of footage, I'm creating a few different gradients so that you can see the difference. In each case, the track will travel 500 meters, with one track built to 2%. The next is built to 4%, which is typically used on metros or other lines with electric traction. And then I take it to the maximum for this area, which is 10%. However, one thing to note that this limit is imposed by the height above ground of the final node, which is 50 meters. If you put this node on a hill, which raises the ground level under it, or you were to draw a shorter track, which increases the angle, you can exceed this 10% and get all the way up to the game's maximum of a 20% gradient. If you want to look at what a 10% gradient looks like with a real train going over it, check this out. Despite the small glitch here where it changes from ground track and onto the elevated track, it does its best to climb, but it's certainly chugging up there. This is another feature that's interesting in terms of vehicles responding to the gradient with a reduction in acceleration and speed. Like with the minimum curve radius, the slope, too steep and gradient indicator is something built into the base game, and I'm keen to see if asset creators can adjust this to set realistic maximums on tracks, or modify the vanilla maximums with a mod. For the rest of the video, I want to run you through a few other observations. In the background though, you'll see me winding up a hill, keeping the maximum gradient at 2% or under. This is to give you an idea of just how slowly you should be climbing mountains to get them up to a particular height, while still maintaining a little bit of realism. For me, overall, the game is very impressive, especially when it comes to the railway mechanics. I like the idea there is now a depot required for all types of vehicles. I like the fact that the new stations are bigger and have a more appropriate size. And I like the fact that you can also get networks far closer to one another. So if you're building an overpass, crossovers, or anything that connects one track with another, it's much more realistic. I like that there are automatic walls with cut and fill on either side of the rails, which you can see being placed automatically as I hug the sides of this mountain. I've not done too much with subways so far, but one thing that I have noticed is that despite the fact that there are elevated tracks, there aren't any elevated stations, which will make it difficult to build cities that are similar to New York, London, and Chicago. It will be interesting to see if this is an oversight, or something that just didn't make into the final cut of the game that is delivered in a future update. The waypoints are also super interesting, and I think that it could enable quite a bit of creativity in terms of people creating dummy freight lines that go in and out of depots or reverse in particular sidings and then come out again. I'm quite keen to see where people take this, because you now have the ability to set routes with far more control than in the first game. Now here's an example of that creativity I was talking about. Rather than go all the way around the mountain to maintain a 2% gradient, I'm creating a zigzag ascent. Now these do exist. There's one in Western Sydney called the Lithgow Zigzag. It has a little bit less craziness, don't get me wrong, but these are definitely a thing. I'm creating these switchback tracks with a maximum gradient of 2%, and I'll then use the waypoints that are built into the game to show you how this paths perfectly in vanilla. There aren't any additional settings you need to change, there's nothing that you need to fight with, you simply set the waypoint and the game just figures it out. I'm really excited to get under the skin of the pathfinding mechanics in the game and see what other things we can do to make railways more realistic and more interesting. So that's a really quick look at the first couple of features of Railway that I've spotted within the new game and in the time that I've had access. I've been very lucky that Paradox Interactive provided me with a copy of the game ahead of release so that I could test these things out. As time goes on, I'm sure we'll find more quirks and things that are a bit strange that we want to try and improve upon. And of course, as the modding scene develops, I'm sure there'll be lots more opportunities to come up with cool, interesting, and realistic ways to make the most of railways in Skylines II.